Okay, we are recording. Okay, today's topic, Introduction to Management Information Systems, or as you may often see it, MIS. Okay, so Management Information System is a combination of technology, by which we generally mean hardware and software, and human factors, people and procedures, and those two are parallel. So hardware is the actual stuff, the machinery, and software is the rules that the hardware must follow. It's how they operate. Same thing for people and procedures. People are the workers and the procedures are the rules that the people follow. And then there's data, right? Lots and lots of data usually these days. So you put all of those together, you have an information system. Now, management information systems typically are designed to perform a specific task or set of related tasks. And big organizations will typically have many information systems. For example, a big retailer like Amazon will have multiple systems for transaction processing, for payroll, for inventory management, for customer relationship management, making sure that everything runs the way it's supposed to. Okay. If you don't, inventory management, of course, is things like keeping track of what goods they have where. Customer relationship management is, for example, reaching out to existing customers, following up on orders, seeing if customers were satisfied or not, trying to upsell them to something else, that sort of thing. Okay. So, a management information system is a kind of information system involving technology, humans, and data, and it's typically built and designed and operated to achieve a particular business task. Okay. Now, we often use information technology without knowing what happens behind the interface, right? This is a wonderful thing. You can show up and use Google, just type in some words, get some search results, even if you have absolutely no idea how Google does it, right? It would be horrible if we had to know how Google works before we could show up and use it. So that's a nice thing as an ordinary user. But if you're going into business, you need a certain base knowledge of information technology. And if you're an IT specialist, right, if you're an IDS major or you get a master's in MIS, for example, then a deeper understanding is, of course, important. So what we do in this course, we present some familiar examples, right? Facebook, Google, Amazon, YouTube, companies that you know, they've been around for a while. We'll learn some of the technology behind the user interface. What we'll see in this course a lot is a trade-off. When there's older tech, it's going to be less immediately relevant, but there's going to be a lot more detail available. For example, if you look at how Google's first versions of the search engine were built like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you can find extremely detailed information about that. They'll tell you exactly how it all works. If you're looking at finding exactly how Google's search engine works now, well, a lot of that is their special sauce, and they don't really want to release it to the wider public. So that's often the trade-off that we see. If information is pretty recent, it's going to be a little bit vague and fuzzy. The further back you go, the more exact detail you can get about how something works. So lectures, we have 4 modules. Each of those covers 3 aspects of an IT-driven business. Again, Facebook, Amazon, Google, YouTube. There's no textbook for the course. There are, however, links to many online articles in the slides. You can read them if you like. If you don't want to, that's okay too. They're for people who have an interest or IDS majors or are maybe a little bit confused by something, want a little bit extra knowledge. Okay, but the articles themselves are generally not testable. Attendance and note-taking is strongly recommended. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the course, but in general, you won't do well on the exam unless you've watched the lectures. And in particular, some sort of active learning where you're like writing down or summarizing the content as you go along, that will help a lot. Each module closes out with an exam, and the exam will not be a simple term match because that wouldn't make much sense, and especially for this kind of remote learning. What we're going to do instead is try to help you re-gear it towards students learning the major concepts and how they're related. And again, we'll get into that more as the course goes on. I'll have some specific examples as we progress. There are going to be multiple choice questions. They'll be detail oriented. Knowing terms is necessary, but again, it's not going to be just match this term to this definition. So knowing terms will not be sufficient to do well on the exam. And certainly you got to respect the volume of the material, right? Even though the exams will be open notes, still, people find them challenging, I promise you. Okay. So one of the problems that happens when you're introducing new material in a tech subject like this, there's an inherent difficulty because you can't explain one thing without assuming a certain amount of knowledge about something else. So there's basically two ways that I could present the course. One of them is try to present all the building blocks of IT, and then once you understand all those adequately, I integrate those into a system. That'll work, but it also tends to be really, really boring. On the other hand, if I just gave you a big picture and then broke it down into its little pieces, that might sacrifice some understanding. It would be a little bit more difficult to follow. So I try to thread this kind of middle ground where I give you a little bit of information about something when you need it. For example, I'll talk briefly about what cloud computing does in the Facebook module, but I won't get into any real detail about it until the Amazon module. So that's what I try to do. If you have questions, please ask. There's time for questions built into the schedule. Generally, when I'm lecturing, I'll get to a convenient break point. I'll stop the recording and I'll say, okay, any questions? Let's bring that up. Okay, this way I can still present the recordings as one continuous stream, but I'll still answer questions in between. In the meantime, you may have to push the I believe button. You may just have to be like, okay, this is true, let's go with it. But there'll be plenty of time for questions. Don't worry about that. Okay, labs, we'll cover Excel, we'll cover databases, we'll cover web page design. Again, there's no lab manual. We'll post the exercises to Blackboard as they're needed, and attendance is graded, as previously discussed. Yeah. Lab work will correspond to homework assignments. So all the homework assignments you get in the lab will be based pretty closely on the things that you actually do in the lab exercises, but they won't be directly connected to exams. There are a few things like when you build database files in Access, that'll help you understand some of these database principles that we talk about in the Facebook module. And a little bit later on when we talk about web design, that may help with a little bit of the content in YouTube. But there's not a lot of overlap between the two, because the main point of lab is really ensuring that you know Excel and have experience with databases. Okay, syllabus is up on Blackboard. Excuse me, it's up on Blackboard. If you have any questions, you can always ask, but I feel like we covered that. Okay, and our 4 topics. So Facebook, we cover 3 topics. Photo management, that's the one we'll start off with on Thursday. Then feed management and access and security. For Amazon, we get a few topics. Google, we get a few topics. YouTube, we get a few topics. Also in the YouTube module, we have a bonus lecture about how the intranet works. So there'll be that. Okay. So I think now I'm going to take a convenient point to ask for questions. One. Okay, so we're back. Let's do this. We'll talk about this PowerPoint from our slideshow. Okay, 3 basic principles of online business. So over the last 25 years or so that internet business has been a thing, we've seen a few recurring phenomena, things happening over and over. Number 1, domination by economies of scale. Number 2, old products enabling new ones. And number 3, technology disrupting entire industries. Understanding those 3 things is pretty much the core of understanding online business. It'll help you understand how we got to where we are in 2020 and what's coming down the pipeline. There we go. So economies of scale just basically means as your operation gets bigger, as you're making more stuff, the cost of making each individual unit goes down. Now, if you think about it for manufacturing, simple example, if you build 1 car, it's not worth the trouble to make a whole big assembly line, right? It's just an assembly line is a big expensive thing to do. If you're only making 1 car, there's no way you're going to make your money back on that. But if you're building 1,000,000 cars, then the assembly line becomes a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful way to save a lot of costs, and that's why they do it. Same thing happens with services. You can think of an example of a hospital. If a hospital is getting 1 patient a day, but they still don't know exactly what kind of patient they're going to get, then yeah, they have to have all that gear on hand. It's going to be pretty expensive. But if a hospital is large and is processing thousands of patients every day, then yeah, they can operate kind of like an assembly line, right? More what's called a job shop, but still, their equipment will get used a lot more efficiently. So, same kind of thing for online businesses. It costs, for example, Facebook costs the same to build Facebook's platform, whether they have 1 user or 2 billion users. It costs Google the same amount to develop its search engine, whether it has 1 daily user or billions of daily users. So if they have billions of daily users, of course, they get a lot more return on their investment. Okay. Other thing, in general, the value of a network tends to grow much faster than the number of connections, roughly equivalent to the number of connections squared. So if you take the assumption that everybody who's part of that network, like a social network like Facebook, every time you add on a new person, well, that person is going to provide some value to a bunch of other people. So he's going to add more. A good example of this, eBay, right? So you guys are all familiar with eBay, the online auction site. eBay gets a lot of sellers because there are a lot of buyers. Well, you get a lot of buyers on eBay because there are a lot of sellers. So once it gets big, it kind of creates its own gravity as a marketplace. It keeps drawing people in. You can see this sort of thing happening on Facebook. Users stay because their friends stay, right? Every now and then people go through waves of saying, oh, I'm going to dump Facebook, or there's this new interesting social media site. But you go there and it's kind of a ghost town. There's like 5 people you know, as opposed to several hundred people you know on Facebook. And so you're like, yeah, why am I bothering? I'll go back to Facebook, even though I may have some issue with it. Okay. Same thing for Google, because Google has more searchers, they get more data, so they can optimize their ad selection, what ads get shown with what search results, for example, so they get more revenue per ad. They place better ads, get a better response rate, they make more money, right? So all of these are good examples of economies of scale. In general, on the internet, if your company gets big, it wins, with a few notable exceptions, okay, which we'll talk about before today is over. Second thing, products as platforms. A lot of the biggest online businesses lost money for years while building market share. Amazon, if I recall correctly, did not show any official profit for its first, I believe 17 years of operation. Now, they could have decided, yeah, for accounting purposes, we want to show a profit, but they kept, putting the money back into the business. So, yeah, officially, for tax purposes, they were not having a profit. But when your product is a platform, like Facebook, for example, you have to find new ways to extract money from it. Or same thing for Google, right? Google, the search engine use is free. They make money primarily from advertising, so they can do a better job of delivering those ads. But Google has a lot of other secondary products too. For example, things like Google Play, where they get a little cut of any applications that are sold through that, or YouTube, which is under the Alphabet umbrella, which, is kind of a holding company for Google. So they have that. Over time, they find new ways to extract money from their existing operations. Amazon, of course, is probably the best one, though. You talk about their growth from a bookseller in 1994 to being the world's dominant online retailer and the biggest cloud service provider. So that's what happens. Companies find new ways to develop new products from their old ones. Last one, disruption by new technology. So as long as there's been technology, there's always been the possibility that some new technology could come around and displace it, right? And this has been going on for literally thousands of years. So way, way, way back when, in ancient Egypt, they had metal. When they were first coming out with metal, the first ones they were digging out of the ground were copper and gold. And the reason is they could occasionally be found, well, gold always found in its pure state because it doesn't really oxidize. But copper would also be occasionally found in its pure state. Copper is better for weapons than gold. It's harder, holds an edge better, that sort of thing. But eventually somebody figured out that by alloying copper and bronze together, or copper and tin together, they could make bronze. And bronze was better for weapons than copper was. So the Bronze Age happened, right? And countries like the Greek Empire basically ran around ancient Egypt because bronze was better for weapons than copper. Eventually, you had iron tools and weapons. Well, iron, you know, it rusts, but as long as it doesn't rust, it's better for weapons than bronze. But the main advantage of iron is that copper and tin are relatively rare. They're hard to get to. They don't occur together. Iron, on the other hand, is pretty abundant. It's in a lot of places. And so by the time iron became a thing, you could outfit entire armies with iron tools and weapons. So the countries or the nations that had access to iron tools and weapons, like ancient Rome, ended up rolling over everybody else. Or if you want to go that far back, the Hittites that came out of the mountains around where Syria is, and they rolled down into Egypt around 1000 BC too. So creative destruction, it happens. It's been around for a long, long time. Horses got displaced by trains, got displaced by cars, for example. Now, and those aren't, you know, IT examples, but we can talk about some of those too. For example, some of you may remember MySpace, although increasingly I think we're getting to the time where none of my students will. MySpace was social media before Facebook. When Facebook came along, they solved a lot of problems of scale much better than MySpace did. And so people stayed on Facebook instead of MySpace. MySpace died. That's probably the single best example of a technology that couldn't handle scale and got replaced by another. Other technology, brick and mortar bookstores, right? Once upon a time, 30 years ago, if you wanted to go buy a book, you actually went into a physical store and looked around on shelves and asked somebody, hey, do you have such and such title in stock? Well, you don't really do that much these days. You go to Amazon, there are some used bookstores, but there aren't much in the way of bookstores anymore, not like there used to be. Another one, iPhones replaced Blackberries, right? So before there were iPhones, there were Blackberries. They were nice little devices. People who had them liked them a lot, but when the iPhone came along, they pretty much blew the Blackberries out of the water. So, disruption by new tech. Now, there's some new things coming up. We'll see how they happen, right? So one of them that's happened recently in the last few years, plugins like Macromedia Flash or Adobe Flash now, I guess, has been replaced by HTML5. The new generation of web page language has largely made plugins obsolete. Another one, so right now Google dominates search, right? So Bing does maybe 10% of the business that Google does, right? Probably substantially less than that, maybe 5%. But suppose Bing and Amazon partner together to develop better spoken word interpreters, right? Like Amazon's Dot versus Google's devices, they might have a real business there, right? So they might, one of the next things that's likely to happen is automated car driving through something like the Alexa. So that's an interesting possibility. And then right now, Uber and Lyft, right? They kind of came out of nowhere to dominate the taxi industry. Right now, they're definitely winning against licensed taxis. Anytime I've ridden in a few taxis, just regular ones in the last few years. And whenever I do, you know, the driver's been like, oh, thank you. You know, we appreciate when people choose a real taxi to ride in because they're grateful for the business, I guess. But what's going to happen to Uber and Lyft's model when self-driving cars become reality, which is probably not that far off. So these are all interesting things. Hopefully I'm still around to see what happens, but I'm sure pretty much all of you will be. It'll be very interesting. Okay, so this is where I'm going to stop for the day. I'm going to stop the recording.